Alrighty, hello students, and welcome back to our module on socialization. So we're continuing the lecture from our discussion of culture and now moving into a conversation about socialization. So we did leave off on this point about material markers of culture, where we were looking at the ways in which clothing could be used to determine what class somebody actually came from, right? And then you have access to Barbara's article this week talking about her experience of that in the modern day, right? And so culture is something that's taught to us, right? And so we, as sociologists, we're very interested in understanding how we learn to become members of our given society, right? We call that process the process of socialization. So as the definition says here, this is straight from your textbook, socialization is the process by which people come to understand societal norms and expectations, to accept society's beliefs, and to be aware of societal values. It's how you learn how to be a person in your given society, essentially, right? You learn to understand what roles you should take on, what roles you shouldn't take on, what's considered polite, what's considered impolite, what the norms are around eating dinner together, what the norms are in a classroom, things like this, right? Like how to actually behave and socialize and be a part of our society, essentially, right? So you'll be looking for socialization agents in the documentary that you're watching this week. And there's a few different ones that we think about as sociologists. They include primary socialization, excuse me, I just ate dinner, pardon, secondary socialization, peer groups, oh boy, sorry, excuse me, peer group socialization, and mass media as well, right? So I'll go through these for you all. Primary socialization, generally speaking, comes from your family or whoever ended up raising you, right? So these are your first experiences with language, values, beliefs. It's usually what you experience in your family, what your familial norms are. You learn how to talk, generally from the people that are raising you, right? You learn about what your family values. So for example, some families value not using profanity, right? And so if you say a curse word when you're a kid because you don't know that it's a curse word, right? Your family might reprimand you and say, we don't say that word, or whatever it might be, right? But if you're in a family that doesn't care so much about cursing and you say a curse word when you're a kid, right? Maybe they'll laugh and encourage you until you go and say that in public in front of other people, right? But what you're learning there are what your family values, right? And so you're first learning how to be a member of the society that is your family specifically, right? And then we have secondary socialization. This is where you start learning about people other than your family, right? And so this is where you become socialized outside of the home. Typically, this starts with school. It might also sometimes be like a church group, like play groups, something like this, right? But you start being socialized outside of the home. That's where we learn about the values and beliefs and behaviors of people who are different from us, right? And so perhaps your home was a Buddhist home, right? And so you learn the traditions of Buddhism and the values of Buddhism, right? And now you go to school and you meet people who are Christian or Muslim, right? And so now you're learning about the cultural values of Christians and Muslims alongside your already rooted values within Buddhism, right? So it's where you start taking in other people's ideas, right? And again, typically school, but could be anything from like church groups, sports groups, play dates, whatever, this kind of stuff, right? People outside of your home, essentially, okay? The next area of socialization would include our peer groups. So this can happen at school too, right? But these are the social groups whose members have interests, social positions, and usually share an age in common, right? So this is often school as well. But again, could be like sports or anything like this, right? Peer group socialization is a type of secondary socialization, but we just differentiate them because there's many different forms of this when this happens, right? So these are where we start to learn about social categories, how those categories inform what we should do in certain social situations, and what like behavior people are supposed to have in those particular social groups, right? So think about, for example, typical high school experience, right? You've got your jocks, you've got your nerds, you've got your burnouts, and you've got your preps. Close your eyes, pause the video, close your eyes. What does each of those groups look like? I'm guarantee it. You have an image of a jock, you have an image of a burnout coming to your mind, right? Typically everybody, when I'm in my in-person classes, shouts out, burnouts are potheads, right? But then, right, we start to talk about what are the stereotypes that are associated with potheads, right? Those become the norms and the social prescriptions right here, right, that we apply to different groups, right? And so you start to become a member of one of the, of many of these groups, sometimes multiple, sometimes one of them. Well, we won't talk about where I was. We weren't the jocks or the nerds, or the preps, I'll just put it that way. I just distracted myself with that. Sorry. But, right. So we know that if we say jocks, right, we're going to be thinking about people who are into sports. If we say nerds, we're probably going to be thinking about people who might be considered like what's the word I'm looking for? The teacher's pet, right? Maybe folks who also are into like Dungeons and Dragons or whatever, this kind of stuff, right? Preps, we're going to be thinking about possibly also teachers' pets, right? But generally, this generally comes with like a class analysis, right? Whereas usually somebody who maybe is in the middle or upper class, right, wears nice clothes, right, clean cut, all this kind of stuff, right? So we start to learn about what those norms are for the peer groups that we are a part of. And then, of course, mass media plays a huge role in shaping social attitudes. We'll actually be diving into mass media specifically in a module down the line, I think module 11 or 12, something like that. We also learn our social roles and social attitudes by watching media, right? This is everything from television, movies, to social media, video games, books, comic books, manga, whatever it is, right? All this kind of stuff, right? So this mass media in particular has a huge influence on the attitudes of young viewers, but also on just all of society, essentially, right? And so when we get into mass media, and we'll be talking about the role of corporate media in several weeks here, right, we'll start to dive into this more. But as you're watching the documentary this week, I really want you to pay attention to what types of socialization are teaching people the behaviors of a consumer culture, right? So keep this in mind. Also, this would be a good place to pull out your textbook and just have the chapter on socialization open as you are watching the documentary and getting ready for this week's discussion, okay? Yeah, great. So we did talk about, I told you briefly that there were three main categories of sociological theories. No, two main categories of sociological theories. The first one being macro theories, which included, yay, you all got it right. Well done. So it's conflict theory and functionalism, right? Good job. And they study the relationship between social institutions, large social groups, and different societies, right? Whereas we also have symbolic interaction theory. This is a micro theory that's interested in the day-to-day interactions between individuals and groups of people, right? This is about how regular people in their everyday lives, where they're just going around, you know, going to work, doing whatever it is they do, right, make meaning out of their everyday lives, right? So as it says here, that's a micro-sociological frame. You can just refer to it as a micro frame. That's fine. And it basically asks, how do we construct meaning and a sense of self through everyday interactions with others? How do individuals interact and create meaning? So the three key ideas from symbolic interaction theory include the idea that meanings are important and have multiple interpretations, that meanings grow out of relationships, and so as the relationship changes, so too do meanings, and that meanings are negotiated between people. We don't accept each other's meanings uncritically necessarily, right? And so if somebody, for example, if you maybe say you were involved in sports in high school, right? But you were also involved in theater, and so you were kind of a nerd at the same time, right? And so somebody refers to you as a jock. Maybe you're like, I don't see myself as a jock. I see myself as just a kid, right? Or as somebody who's like super into theater and I just happen to do sports as well, whatever it might be, right? We negotiate the meanings people put on us, right? Constantly in our day-to-day interactions. Yes. So I'm going to leave it there and just give you some examples here. So this is some examples of consumption and the socialization of the self and how we start to form who we think of as us, right? I would encourage you to look back into your textbook as well and look at the socialization theories of George Mead. That will help with your discussion board post this semester or this module as well. And so what we've really started to see within a consumer culture, right, is that the way we start to understand ourselves is through that lens of consumption, right? And so think about it in terms of like, are you a Coke person or a Pepsi person? Or maybe neither. Maybe you're an RC person, right? And then you're really rebellious, right? Are you an Adidas person or a Pumas person, right? Are you a Ford person or a Honda person? I'm sorry if you're a Ford person. No, shade intended. Okay. But nonetheless, right. But what I'm getting at here, right, is that we start in a consumer culture, we often start to form our sense of self through our own consumption habits. And so, for example, here I have my my reusable water bottle, right? I can illustrate that I am a person who cares about the environment and who wants to reduce my waste by purchasing this particular type of product, a reusable water bottle, so that I'm not using plastic, so on and so forth. If I want to be seen as an environmentally sustainable person, if that's how I identify myself, right, then I can show that with my consumption habits by buying things that are reusable, sustainable, made of organic materials, so on and so forth. This is also true of me, although I'm far from perfect and organic stuff is expensive, right? But I do try to reduce my waste as much as possible, right? And so what we see within this consumer culture is that we do very much like to feel unique. The brands that we utilize, the goods that we utilize, right, tell a particular story about who we are, right? We can also see that we self-brand for like careers, romantic partners, lifestyle brands, etc., right? This is prolific on social media. You can go through social media and you can see the trad wife brand, you can see the queer brand, you can see the racial justice brand, the tech bro brand, like all these kind of different things, right? And ways that we brand ourselves to sell ourselves on the market in one way or the other, or to express our individual identity, right? So, I mean, you can also think about the Kardashians, right? Or maybe you don't want to, and I'm sorry for bringing them up, but nonetheless, right? The Kardashians, when we say the Kardashians, whatever your individual opinion of them may or may not be, right? A particular image comes to mind. Probably folks who are wealthy, right? You have folks who are wealthy, folks who, it's a particular family that we know that exists because of their reality television show, right? People who are very focused on their individual wealth. This is all I know about the Kardashians. It's not, I don't know about them, right? But you get a particular image that comes to mind. Generally, folks who are beautiful, or our concept of beautiful, right? You know that they're a family, and you know kind of if you watch the Kardashians, you're going to get some drama, and you're going to expect that because that's the brand that they've developed and sold for themselves, right? So it's also important for us to think about how, as Dr. Hearn says here, right, that cultural forces and discourses have given rise to overt practices of self-branding, right? So this also means that there's power embedded in this one way or the other, right? Whereas consumer habits can feel like tools of self-expression, the paradox is that we're all buying the same brands, right? So maybe you're a Pepsi person, you prefer Pepsi to Coke, that's fine, right? But how many other people also prefer Pepsi to Coke, right? So are we actually expressing our individual identity, right? Or are we engaging in brand? How do I put this? Are we expressing our identity or the versions of ourselves that we are being sold, essentially, right? What is it supposed to mean to be a Pepsi person versus a Coca-Cola person? What does it mean to be a Ford person versus a Chevy person or versus a Subaru person? right? Are we being sold those identities rather than actually expressing who we are? Okay. All right. So I think I'm just going to leave it here for today. Now you are going to be using this concept of symbolic interaction and potentially and socialization this week. You might use some of this consumption in the socialization of self as well, but you're going to be looking at, because we're watching a documentary on fast fashion, you're going to be looking at both the environmental sustainability associated with fast fashion and also the labor conditions associated with fast fashion. And so focusing in on symbolic interaction theory is going to help you with the labor part quite a bit. So again, I would recommend using your textbook as a supplement here, or of course sending me questions, posting questions in the community forum, right? Those would all be helpful spaces to continue this conversation. About how symbolic interaction theory works and how meaning is being negotiated through the various symbols that we kind of engage in every day, right? So you'll be looking at, for this question in particular, you'll be looking at garment workers' campaigns for improved working conditions. We'll think about how that changes our relationship to labor, consumption, so on and so forth. Okay, folks, this one's a little bit short today. I know the first weeks were kind of long, so I wanted to keep these a little bit shorter for you. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, I will see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.